This is Nattering with E with your host, Eric Friedlander. Hi everyone, it's Eric. Just letting you know that this week's episode is actually a repeat of a previous episode. That's right, as we get into the Nattering with E history of the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975 through music, what better way than to start at the beginning? And so, today, the beginning. Before we get started with that, though, please listen to this message from our sponsors, the Visionaries Global Media.
Welcome to Visionaries Global Media, your number one source for podcasting entertainment. Visionaries Global Media, envisioning excellence on a global scale.
A Nattering with E solo production, The Vietnam War in Music, 1955 to 1975. Welcome to episode 1 of an ongoing Nattering with E project. I'm your host, Eric Friedlander. Today, we'll be talking about the War on Vietnam through music, 1955 to 1975. Today, the beginning, the 1950s, a time that's not as looked at by many people as you'd hope. While I was doing my research, I was trying to find a lot of music so that I could discuss the 1950s, but it's mostly war-based and it's a lot of history, which I'm fine with too. Before we get going, I should preface this by saying that I am no expert. I have a undergrad in history, but besides that, I don't have a master's. I'm learning just as much as you, and this should be all fun and games for all of us. Maybe we'll learn something. Maybe we'll have some guests on. Who knows? But I hope you come along for the ride every week. The War on Vietnam through music, 1955 to 1975. In the 20 years that we know about for one of the most important wars in history, we should start at the beginning. One area of fascination for me was and remains the Asia-Pacific region, particularly Vietnam, but also further back in Japan. As a kid, I was fascinated with war. No interest. I should preface that by saying no interest at all in joining the military. I respect what they do, but I'm definitely not brave enough to go overseas and fight and defend my country. That's not to say I'm a coward, but I'd only do it if they really, really made me, like conscription, which we'll talk about in a later episode. But it was always an area of interest for me. Growing up in the 90s, as you'll hear on my other podcast, 90s Nostalgia Hour, featuring myself, SJ, and Powerhausen. A lot of the 90s had plenty of the 90s and a lot of the 80s had a lot of movies from Hollywood going back and talking about the war in Vietnam or World War II or the Korean War. So with the what's interesting about this is that our plan for this project is that the plan is simple. We're going to look at the war itself from its beginnings and the music that came with it, both for and against America and its allies' involvement. And also, we may look at some of the music that was played by the North Vietnamese and their allies, such as China and Russia, during this time. Okay, so we're in the 1950s now. It's been about 10 years since World War II ended, and while America and the Allied nations were able to defeat the Axis powers, keeping pace remains a major issue. 5 years after the Second World War ended, Korea engaged in a civil war pitting communist nations China and the Soviet Union in support of North Korea against South Korea, which was allied with the United States and Canada, amongst other nations. Similar to the upcoming war in Vietnam, the Korean War was as much about fighting political ideals as it was about maintaining peace in the nation. Look, to be honest with you, it wasn't about peace. It was about power. Ultimately, all of these wars come down to power. When World War II ended, the Allied nations basically divided up everything between themselves, from everything that the Axis powers owned. So Germany, Korea, Japan, Italy, all of that was divided amongst the US and the Soviet Union and Britain and France. Smaller nations such as Canada weren't included in gaining territories because they were a territory themselves, so to speak, as part of the British Commonwealth. So they were basically obligated to fight in these wars, the Korean War, the two world wars, and also to an extent the Vietnam War. America, on the other hand, had gained its independence from Britain back in the 18th century, and therefore they weren't really obligated to come into the war in World War II, but Japan forced them in when Japan, I'm going to call them greedy, tried to take Hawaii from the U.S., which uh, was a big no-no because Pearl Harbor had basically the major fleet for the US, and the US was just not having it. Once Pearl Harbor was bombed, they were like, okay, we're getting fully involved in World War II, which was interesting because it came later in World War II, whereas Britain, France, and their Commonwealth nations were there from the beginning to fight the Axis powers. Uh, going back to the Korean War, what's interesting about this is that 5 years earlier, the Soviet Union went from uh, not being partners with Germany anymore to becoming an allied nation. And then all of a sudden, they're seen by the US as the only other great power who could really rival them. And thus, an unofficial war known as the Cold War started. Uh, the reason for the Cold War was basically that the US believed that the entire world should be capitalist nations, whereas the Soviets believed that communism was the right way. Karl Marx's communism was the correct way to join up and have the world governed. So one of the major points of this was that the uh, Americans wanted Asia to be a democratic capitalist continent, while the Soviet Union and China wanted everything to be communist. So North Korea to this day remains a communist nation, while South Korea remains a capitalist nation. The war started in 1950 and went until 1953. To quickly summarize it, the all that really came about from this war, if I'm being honest, from what I know, is that a border was created so that we have North Korea, which is now run by a communist nation, by the communists, and South Korea, which is still part of the rest of the world to a degree. The ideals of Korea's nation stem from the United States and Soviet nations gaining the most power in the aftermath of World War II. Essentially, after Japan and Germany and Italy all accepted defeat in World War II, the countries they ruled over were divided up amongst the Allies, which I just spoke about. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, so essentially nothing really got solved during the Korean War. It was just basically, okay, the South will be part of the capitalism and the North will be part of communism. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, during this time, France had always ruled Vietnam from the 19th century onward. There'd been various battles over the years of the locals trying to gain their independence, but they were always foiled by the French. However, during World War II, as I mentioned, Japan was able to come into Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Korea, all China, all these other nations, and attempt to take them over, as they wanted to create one Japanese, basically, a Japanese ruled supercontinent, and then Germany would get the West Coast and Europe. So if you've ever watched the show Man in the High Tower on Amazon Prime, I recommend it. It's actually very good. Uh, I've only seen a couple of episodes, but it basically argues that this is what society would have looked like if the Axis powers had won World War II. So, as you can imagine, resistances all over Europe are still fighting against the Germans, while resistances in Asia are fighting all over uh, Asia, trying to combat the Japanese. So, what's interesting about that too is that it speaks to the idea that sometimes what's good at one point is bad eventually. And what I mean by that is that in Vietnam, as I mentioned before, Japan reached Japan tried to basically take over and fight the French. The French were no match, so they needed some help. Enter Ho Chi Minh, who created the Viet Minh, which was the original guerrilla style military resistance fighters that would go on to become the Viet Cong, which was the North led army during the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. What's interesting about this is that initially, France, US, Russia, China, um, all the allied countries are like, hey, yeah, cool, Ho Chi Minh, we'll give you the support so that you can absolutely fight the Japanese and use your guerrilla tactics to basically force them out of the country or even to surrender and capture them. And it was totally fine because it benefited all of these allied nations. Fast forward to the war in Vietnam, and it's Ho Chi Minh who's back again, but he's getting support from China and from the Soviet Union in order to create a full-on communist state or communist nation, rather. And suddenly, everybody else is like, "Wait, we don't want that. We don't want you to have such power because then." That's a threat to us, and that's a threat to our ideals of capitalism and democracy. And so, uh, and so they're able to force out. Essentially, they're able to force out the Japanese, and the Japanese eventually surrender after the atomic bombs from the U.S. in Japan, and the other nations are able to also gain a measure of property from Japan and from these other Axis nations in World War II. So what ended up happening is that while everybody else was dealing with the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, the Vietnam was entrenched in a battle between Ho Chi Minh's forces and the French. As for the most part, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were like, "Yeah, we'll help you this time because my enemy's enemy is my friend, but once those guys are gone, we're back to our fight." And France was like, "Wait, why would we want to fight you again, given the fact that you just helped us? Just accept that we're going to be the bosses forever, and you guys can just get in line." And Ho Chi Minh was like, "Nope, don't want to do that. We're going to fight you until you guys concede." And so what essentially what happened was is that where China and the Soviet Union were essential to funding and providing weapons and so on, and even some soldiers to the Viet Minh, the US was simply sending in what they called quote unquote advisors, which were teaching the French and their sympathizers how to fight against the North Vietnamese led Viet Minh. To say this wasn't a fair fight would be an understatement. However, what would end up happening is that by 1954, the North Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh had battered the French forces to a point where, despite the U.S. support of France, the French conceded the war. This ended up leading to part of the Geneva Convention, where France officially agreed, you know what, we're out. We're getting out of here. We're going to move all of our people and all of our sympathizers. We're going to move, and you guys go ahead, Viet Cong. You guys can do your thing and have the nation. However, the U.S. and its sympathizers were like, wait a minute, we're not signing this. This is ridiculous, because by allowing the Viet Minh to win the war with France and regain Vietnam, that would allow access for China and the Soviet Union to come into Vietnam and essentially use it as like a gateway to slowly build communism throughout Asia, which like the US just absolutely cannot allow. And so as you'll see during during the various episodes of this podcast, we'll look at a lot of puppet governments that were instilled in South Vietnam to basically assure that the US always was able to control at least half up until 1975, which we'll get to in probably like 20 or 30, maybe 50 episodes from now. We'll go back to that. So, one thing that I found very interesting about this time period was the fact that the CIA was very heavily involved in, as I mentioned, these advisory roles. They push the propaganda narrative that communism is bad. The communists will murder you if you don't leave, and things like that. So for a 2-year stretch from May 7th, 1954 to May 7th, 1956, over 3 million people, according to Wikipedia, moved from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. Reason being, they were convinced by this propaganda that if they had stayed in North Vietnam, they'd absolutely be murdered and executed, and their families would be destroyed. Like basically their bloodlines would be wiped out. So they rushed down to South Vietnam and into their neighboring nations because it just wasn't safe for them anymore in North Vietnam. The thing was, though, is that it wasn't necessarily that safe to be in South Vietnam either. In October of 1955, Ngo Dinh Diem and Bao Dai, the Prime Minister and Emperor of Southern Vietnam, the first two Prime Minister and Emperors that we'll look at during this 20-year stretch, along with the Americans, openly refused to sign that Geneva Convention, as uniting Vietnam was not what they wanted, as I alluded to earlier. When Ngo Dinh Diem had opposition from a variety of religious groups in the South that suggested, you know what, Neil, maybe communism isn't the worst thing, or maybe we can unite and be one nation because we've been fighting for over 200 years and we're kind of tired of it. And Ngo Dinh Diem was like, no, absolutely not. Like, in the news present day, when you hear about how a country with like a strong dictatorship will all of a sudden have someone come up and like win the election, but will suddenly disappear, and then the guy who was the previous leader lost, and then he'll suddenly remain in power. It was sort of like that back then, in the sense that any opposition that Ngo Dinh Diem and Bao Dai had from these religious groups, they were like, hey, USA, can you guys go deal with them? And what would happen is that suddenly these leaders would go missing, and the government would quickly shut them down and put in and instill these rules that basically said, it's our way or the highway. It's the government will do whatever I say, and that's the end of the story. So I kind of ponder as I'm discussing this with you now, is yes, capitalism is how we're able to do this podcast, but was it necessarily the right thing to do? I mean, all this propaganda that we'll end up looking at in future episodes suggests that, capitalism's the way. Capitalism's the best thing for you. Capitalism, like, let's raise taxes on everything. Let's do this so that it's good, but we're not forcing people to do things, or so they say. But then you could look at it and say, you know what? You kind of did force them to do this thing where a lot of people wanted them to not uh, secede into having two nations, a North Vietnam and a South Vietnam. We just saw in Korea how two nations were basically formed, and there's literally like a border where you can't go across that border or else like you're never heard from again unless you're Dennis Rodman, who apparently is like buddies with the leaders of North Vietnam. It's very bizarre. um but what's interesting about this is that it seemed like the guys who the US brought into power in the um South Vietnam weren't necessarily the best people, and we'll see throughout the 20 years that uh you make one wrong alliance and it could cost you more than just being out of power. So with Ngo Dinh Diem having uh, a variety of religious groups in the South shut down so that he could be the overbearing leader of South Vietnam, he would have elections look like he had won by a landslide of 98%. According to Wikipedia, U.S. advisors, aka the CIA, was telling him, no, 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 make it look like it's 60 to 70%, so that at least it looks like your opposition had 30 to 40% of the vote, which completely wasn't the case. To say that these were rigged elections would be putting it mildly, and it basically gave way to going back home and having people write various protest songs, be against the war, be against everything. So, music at the start of the Vietnam War. As per rocksock.org in the UK, the Vietnam War was as essential to the creation of rock and soul music as the musicians themselves. By the middle of the 1950s, when rock and roll was really starting to go in an anti-authority route, it stemmed from what was going on in Vietnam and the various other wars. Essentially, rock music has always been this battle of what your parents thought was best to what you want, to what you think is best as a youth. There's countless examples of how Elvis and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, for instance, all started out in the 50s and then got into the thick of things in the 60s in their like 20s, where they were against authority and like writing songs like Can't Show Me Love or things like that, things of that nature, to basically say, you know what, like, we don't have to do what you want to do. I've always felt, and I'll probably push this throughout the podcast, but I've always felt that like McCarthyism and communism and these witch hunts that we'll briefly talk about were as much about the old guard being afraid of change as it was trying to help the nation evolve from being in a variety of wars to gaining the most power and becoming one of the top nations in the world, the US, I mean. So one could, one example of an artist who we'll talk about a ton throughout this podcast is Bob Dylan. He was huge in the 1960s, and he was writing songs as early as the 50s and poetry opposing the war, saying like, you know what, we fought enough in World War II. Why do we have to do these other wars too? Why do the youth or the citizens of the US and its allied nations have to go and do what the government wants and send them overseas to fight overseas. Uh, we're often we often look at the 50s and the 40s as the lost generation because of the youth being forced to fight the wars of their parents or of the politicians way older than them. Uh, Another person that we'll look at later in the 60s is James Brown, the iconic soul singer who would write various episodes of various songs about how wrong the war was. And we'll look at Edwin Starr's The War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing, which came out in 1970, but could literally have come out during the 1950s, 1960s, and the 1970s. And we'll look specifically at John Lennon of the Beatles, who would write songs about wanting peace and harmony and to resolve the conflicts. So that's it for this week's episode of The War on Vietnam Through Music, 1955 to 1975. That's the beginning for you. Where we stand right now in the war is that we're transitioning from France leaving to America and its puppet governments starting to play hardball with the North Vietnamese. Was it the right decision? Was it the wrong decision? Find out next week as we get more into the music of the war and some of the early battles. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out this and the other podcasts on the Nattering with E network, including the 90s Nostalgia Hour with myself, SJ, and Bauerhausen. New episodes every Tuesday at 6 a.m. on Spotify, Podbean, and we are now on Podcast Addict as well. Another show, Nattering with E's main show, where we feature a variety of guests from Brendan to Jordan to Mike to we're going to actually start getting some wrestlers on as well to interview, which will be a lot of fun. So I really hope you join us for that. We're also going to be doing some movie reviews with our friends from ROH Revelry, High Five Tom, and Will Mercier, and the underscores will be making a return in a couple of weeks as NHL training camps are soon to open. And so Joe and myself will resume our bi-weekly love of the Toronto Maple Leafs. For that one, we are going to basically keep doing podcast episodes every year, maybe take off the summers for until the Leafs win the cup. So we could be doing this as crotchety old men when we're 100 years old, but I really hope that you listen to us when we're 100 years old. I just turned 35, so got a lot of time to go with all these episodes. And thank you as always for joining me on an episode of Nattering with E. The War on Vietnam Through Music, 1955 to 1975, is a very large point of interest. Once we finish this, we may do more wars, or we may do more historical conflicts. I might also have my dad on at some point so that we can talk about the Battle of the Somme from World War I, 1917, one of the deadliest, longest battles of all time, as it took literally a year to move 10 feet. Can you imagine that? Like a snail could probably move quicker. Anyways, I'll see you around. Have a nice one.